Welcome back, everyone. Okay, Robert Kenspiro, how are things there?
Always good to be back. In the meantime, quiet. We had some excitement a little, last week, at the beginning of
Yeah,
this week. Was I can't keep track of the most recent missile barrages or attempted missile barrages.
right.
This time Lebanon.
Yeah, so I thought, just an overview of what happened there, basically that Israel intelligence found out that there was supposed to be a very significant attack on Israel. I think they said in the somewhere in the range of maybe was it 3,000 missiles or 6,000 missiles were supposed to be chucked on Israel all at the same time. And these were missiles that were aiming for the center of Israel, for Tel Aviv, for very specific targets. And within a very short amount of time, the Israeli Air Force was able to respond and basically eliminate all of the launchers that were supposed to send those missiles. So it was um, a highly precise pre-strike, which is kind of shocking and basically has sent shockwaves through, I think, multiple militaries around the world. But it really shows that Hezbollah is intent and Lebanon is intent on escalating. There's that word that we always use, escalation, but escalating the situation between Israel and Hezbollah. So I thought it would be really helpful for us to understand a little bit like what the heck is Lebanon doing in this war, anyways, right? Lebanon is a sovereign state. It doesn't really have anything to do with the West Bank or Gaza. So, how do we understand Lebanon? Let's look at the history of it, and can we try to understand why they're involved and then what we're going to do with them? So, where does Lebanon come into the picture? Can we get a bit of historical background on this place?
Sure, yeah. Like previous episodes. Yeah, we want to focus in on modern, Lebanon, what this geopolitical situation, relationship with Israel, but just a little bit of like background information. Lebanon is as an independent state, it's only from modern state from the mid 20th century with the creation of the rest of the Middle East post World War I as a byproduct primarily of British and French colonialism. But if we zoom back in history, it's actually quite interesting. This whole area of the Middle East that Israel is in, that Lebanon, Syria, is called the Levant, which could come from the Greek word having to do with the rising of the sun on the Eastern Mediterranean, which is not an area which, by the way, was occupied by Arabs going back thousands of years ago. The large the earliest group of peoples that we have in this part of the world, because if you go up the coast of Israel, you keep going north, you haven't come to Lebanon. And before the artificially created boundaries that we have in the modern world, this was more or less Canaanite territory, which was occupied by a very interesting group of people called Phoenicians. And
Hmm.
Phoenicians are related. They're known as a seafaring people, but they're primarily based on the coast. But they spread their influence to places like Cyprus and all the way, by the way, to the city of Carthage, which
Wow.
is in like Tunisia today, North Africa. Read about the Second Punic Wars in the second century, the Common Era with the Romans. That was like their main center. So these were a people who are famous for having one of the earliest alphabets, by the way, and an advanced seafaring civilization that was based primarily in cities that are in Lebanon today, places like Sidon and Tyre. So they're considered part of the Canaanite peoples that we interact with when we come into the land of Israel, going back about 3,300 years ago. If you actually like look on a search program for the mentions of Lebanon in the Bible, there's actually quite a few of them. Um, Mostly, by the way, Ellie, the cedars of Lebanon. Arze
Hmm.
Lebanon, famous for them. The emblem of Lebanon is this beautiful cedar tree. It's known for the
Hmm.
wood. Even in the Psalms, we have this in Psalm
Right.
29, which we say on Shabbat, on Kabbalat Shabbat ceremony, when we're bringing the Sabbath in. Yishaber Hashem et Arzei Lebanon, and God shatters the voice of God shatters the cedars of Lebanon. And then if we fast forward to Psalm 92, which we say after we sing Lecha Dodi, it talks about tzaddik katama yifrach, a righteous person like a palm tree will like sprout and bloom. Ki erez belebanon yizgeh, like a Lebanon cedar, it will grow. So it's very
Hmm.
famous that the references to Lebanon are very much related always to trees. It was obviously a good source of
Right.
lumber because Lebanon's further
Right.
north. very mountainous, more rain than we get here, big trees, great for lumber, which
Hmm.
plays into, just to fast forward throughout all the references, because there's so many of them. But if you look in the book of Samuel, when David conquers Jerusalem, it says Hiram, the king of Tyre, which is a city on the coast of Lebanon, south of Beirut and north of Sidon, I believe, who's a friend of an ally of King David. He builds King David a palace. Phoenician king of that kingdom in the north, part of these Canaanite peoples that were allied with the Jewish people. And when David passes away and his son Solomon reigns for 40 years, and as we know, David conquers Jerusalem, and that's where the palace is built. But then Solomon is the king who embarks on that massive, national building project of the temple, where the Bible describes in the book of Kings how he sends these corvees, these 10,000 men at a time, to go a month at a time to Lebanon to basically be lumberjacks. That that Hiram, the king of Tyre, who was Solomon's dad's friend, he says to Solomon, "Your dad was a great guy. I'll help you." So all the wood for the building of the temple is cut in Lebanon, the cedars of
Wow.
Lebanon, and sent
Wow.
in barges down the Mediterranean, then schlepped from Jaffa up to Jerusalem. So the references are there throughout history. This is the whole period of time we call the Late Bronze and Early Iron Age, which is First Temple period in Israel. And then if you follow like the trajectory of what happens to the Phoenicians, it's kind of like, Elliot, kind of mirrors exactly what happens to the Jewish people.
Hmm.
After Solomon, we split into two kingdoms, we fight, we get absorbed, sometimes by Egypt, but mostly by the Assyrian Empire, as do the Phoenicians. Then after the Assyrians come the Babylonians, who basically have a hegemony over the coast of the Mediterranean, which includes Lebanon of today and Israel. And then the Persians come, and it goes on, and the Greeks come. And Alexander the Great, his great military campaign that starts about 333 before the Common Era, he takes a little detour, besieges the island city of Tyre. It's one of the great sieges of human history, is Alexander the Great
Mm.
siege of Tyre. He makes it down to the land of Israel. He conquers the land of Israel, and it becomes part of the Seleucid Greek Empire. And then the Romans come, and meanwhile the Phoenicians basically disappear by we said the last Phoenician stronghold is not in Lebanon, it's in
Hmm.
Carthage in North Africa, but that's pretty much the end of those people. And then
Wow.
after the Romans, we have the Roman Christian Byzantines, and then the Muslims show up in the 7th century. And we have a series of Islamic empires, Umayyads, Abbasids, Ayyubids, Mamelukes. The same ones that rule over what is Israel today are ruling over there. Often, many of them have the center of these empires is in Damascus, which is right on the border. That's modern Lebanon today, is bordered by Syria to the east. So that is the last, and this is where you can we just fast forwarded through thousands of years of history.
Right.
But the last, just like in Israel, the last Muslim, not Arab, conquerors of Israel are the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which is from 1517 to end of 1917. So
Mhm.
too, Lebanon will be part of Greater Syria, with now a mushmash of different populations. Obviously, when the Muslims arrive in the land of Israel, the Arabs, they bring Islam and Arabs to Israel as a colonizing effort, which people don't realize. I mean, creation Zionism is a decolonizing project.
Right.
Actually, think about it. We're
Right.
the we're the surviving indigenous, but
Right. We
there's a
did, by the
Christian.
way, just for people, if you're just listening to this is one of the first you're listening to, there is a whole we did a whole podcast on the colonization of the Middle East and what does that mean exactly and who was colonizing and when. And so it's a really important piece of information in order to be able to understand what is happening in the Middle East today. So just as
Right.
an aside, if you haven't heard that, I definitely recommend go back and listen to that episode.
And interesting, because when Christianity originates in the Middle East as an offshoot of Judaism, and then morphs into a separate faith in the 4th century. Constantine the Great, and Lebanon and Israel are part of that Eastern Greek-speaking Byzantine Empire. And even when Islam shows up, much of the population will convert to Islam, but especially in the mountain areas. Lebanon is very mountainous. There'll be a very strong Maronite Christian population, which is interesting because Maronites are actually closely affiliated with the Catholic Church. And if you know your
Hmm.
history of Christianity, the Eastern Orthodox Church 1,000 years ago splits away from the Catholic Church and doesn't follow the Pope. That was the big issue. So that Maronite Christian population remains as a small percentage of Lebanon's population until today, but is still there.
Hmm.
So it's what you see happening. It's kind of like what you get in Israel, only a little more even diverse. All different peoples who moved in and occupied, and the different faiths that were founded here and conquering each other. You have in Israel today, where you have a Jewish population, but you have a large Sunni Arab population. There's Israeli Arabs, and then you have those Palestinian population, but you also have Druze, who are an offshoot of Shiite Islam 1,000 years ago, who are the Druze population. We don't know how many Druze are in the world, but it's actually a relatively small population.
Do the Jews
So,
identify as Islamic though?
no, Druze is an offshoot faith, and this
Right.
estimate,
So
we don't know,
it's a
maybe a
different
million.
faith altogether.
Yeah, maybe a million Druze, primarily in Syria, but significant. Like maybe 5% of the population of Lebanon is Druze, and Israel has
Right.
over 100 something thousand, 140,000 Druze, I think, living in both the Golan Heights and in northern Israel. So we have similar mixes. The difference is Lebanon has stuff that we don't have so much in Israel. There's a large Shiite population.
Mhm.
If you fast forward till today, it's about 30 something percent of the country Shiite,
And
Muslim
just
about 30
remind
something.
people, Shiite aligns with Saudi Arabia or with Iran?
Shiite is Iranian. The
Got it.
majority, about 85% of the Islamic world are Sunni. Remember, just to go back to stuff we covered on before, that most
Mhm.
Arabs are Muslim, but most Muslims aren't Arab. 70% of the Islamic world, that's 56 countries that have Islam as the dominant faith, the vast majority of them are Arab, only 22 states of the Arab League. And most of those Arab states, like Indonesia being the largest Islamic state, most of these Islamic states are Sunni. You have but primarily you have Shiite population in Iraq. You have Shiite in Syria. You have Shiite in Lebanon. You don't have Shiite in Israel. So yeah, but it's a very interesting. If you like rewind, you see how all these different ethnic groups got in there, and all these different religious groups got in there. And if we talk about what happens if we really hit the play button, which is World War One, because World War One is really when everything changes in the Middle East. Because like we spoke about, the Ottomans are here from 1517 to the end of 1917.
And
During World
is that the heyday of Beirut? Is that when they're saying like Beirut is the Paris of the Middle East? When does that play
No,
into
the heyday of
this?
Beirut is really it's more post that, actually.
Okay, so we're gonna
Although
get
remember,
there.
Lebanon, Beirut is a very important trading center historically. It's in terms of getting into Syria and Damascus and going further into the Middle East. It's a major port on the Mediterranean. A lot of these countries, like Iraq, don't have ports on the Mediterranean. So
Hmm.
just Israel. So it's a very important commercial center, and it's very culturally very diverse. So that makes for a very interesting place in terms of architecture, in terms of cultures, in terms of economic opportunities. It's had its ups and downs, no
Right.
question, in history, different periods of
Okay, so
time.
back to World War One, you were
Yeah,
starting to take us there. So how does that go?
right, right. So during 1916, during the war, the French, it's called Sykes-Picot Agreement. The French and the British are already planning, like, hey, what are we going to do? Because we want the Middle East for trade, for access to the Suez Canal, for oil, which becomes very important in the middle of World War One, because the
Hmm.
British will switch their fleet from coal to oil. And it's literally in the next couple of years, with the end of World War One, which is 1918, but already with by that period of time, when the war ends, the French and the British basically get together in a series of agreements. We have it's the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, which is basically the treaty the French make with the Ottomans, where they basically give up on their empire. That's the end of the Ottoman Turkish Empire and the emergence of the
Wow.
modern Turkish Republic. But all those territories that were theirs in the Middle East will now fall into the hands of, this is the Treaty of San Remo, also in 1920 in Italy, which we've talked about, where the victorious Allied powers come together to create the modern Middle East. And what we want to focus on for understanding Lebanon, we talked about already, the British mandate becomes primarily what is going to be, the area of today Jordan, Iraq, and Israel. That's the British big area of control. But the French mandate is going to be, meaning what they get as the spoils of war at the end of World War One, is going to be Lebanon and Syria. And they basically already going back to, the treaty by the 1920s, early 1920s, the French have already delineated what's going to be Lebanon as a territory. But the creation of the modern state of Lebanon is really in 1943.
Hmm.
When it's created as an independent country, with the French still overseeing it, by the way,
And that's
until 19.
created as part of San Remo, or that's created as part of the mandate? Who
It's part.
creates Lebanon as the modern state we know today?
Well, the French do. Remember, San Remo gives the mandates. The French mandate. We're going to supervise this area until such time as we withdraw. This is the whole history of European powers in places like Africa. A place like Bechuanaland becoming, Botswana, things like that. These are the colonial powers pulling out and granting independence to countries in Africa and the Middle East, and also you have India becoming a huge country. The British will keep hold of Hong Kong until very recently, relatively speaking. So it's a process of several decades whereby these colonial powers, which won this territory as the spoils of war in World War I, will be involved in the creation of modern nation states that they will eventually completely pull out of, granting them completely full independence, which in the case of Lebanon will be 1946. In the case of Israel will be 1948. So this is the creation of this very interesting state, which till today the French maintain a very keen interest in. All the colonial powers or post-colonial powers of the modern world still have close relationships, like England has with Jordan, not so much with Israel, interestingly enough.
Mm-hmm.
But they tried. It's a very interesting experiment, because we've talked about this before, Ellie, that nationalism is not a concept that is in the Arab mind. The Arab, Islamic world Islam is very much a product of the Arab mind. It's very much based on clans and tribes. So the national experiment in the Middle East hasn't really worked so well in many different places, like we see in Iraq. We have so many failed states because they're artificial creations that are not based on cohesiveness of peoples that are naturally drawn to each other because of their ethnic or religious connections. Like you take Iraq is a great example. Let's take Sunnis and Shiites and some Druze and some Kurds, a lot of Kurds, and some Yazidi. These often interesting little groups of people. There's just a lot of subsects of Islam, Alawites and Islamiyas and things like that. They're these really small sects of Islam. And let's see if we can get them to live together. And it doesn't really work so well. But Lebanon is a really unique experiment where, as part of their constitution, the agreement founding Lebanon, since its inception, is that an independent Lebanon in 1946, basically, the prime minister has to be a Maronite Christian.
Fascinating.
Okay,
why that?
So because that's just the way they worked it out, because it's division of powers, like the president, the prime minister, the speaker of the parliament. The speaker has to be a Shiite, and the prime minister has to be Sunni. And then the deputy prime minister has to be Greek Orthodox. Wow. And so on. But this is in the Constitution. It's enshrined, which makes for very interesting politics in Lebanon, which sort of kind of functioned fast forward to 1948, by the way, when Israel declares itself a state. I mean, Lebanon, not being a major world power, being a small country, smaller than Israel, with a smaller population even today, the Lebanese did participate in the Israeli War of Independence, meaning Lebanese forces attacked Israel in the north, but they were basically a sideshow. They did not do too much.
What was their intent in attacking then?
It was the intent of the 5 Arab armies it was actually 6, really. Some sent forces, like Saudi Arabia sent. The countries that bordered Israel, which are Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, the other 3, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, were full throttle invasions, with also the Arab Army of Liberation that was based in 1948 in the land of Israel attacking.
Just to clarify, I know we've touched on this, but just basically those countries were attacking Israel with the intent of there should be no Jewish state in the Middle East.
Yeah. British pull out. Remember, the French have already left. With some British pressure, they got out of Lebanon.
Meaning, like, all of those states were created at the same time: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Israel. Like, the mandates all happened within a few years of each other. They were all newly created states, but Lebanon, Syria, Jordan said, we don't want a Jewish state here, so we're going to get rid of it.
Right, right. These countries again had their own rivalries and issues, but the common thing that united them was the desire to destroy a Jewish state. We shouldn't go into the reason behind that, but the whole creation of a recreation of a Jewish state in the heart of an Arab Islamic world is just not acceptable from on many different levels. So yeah,
And
remember
the
Israel.
reason, just to say, I think that's important right now is that's before an IDF. That's before any kind of thing with the Palestinians. There wasn't even really the name Palestinian at that point. If it was, it applied to Jews, not to Arabs. I just think that's very important in terms of
Yeah,
there was just a already this idea that there was an absolute intolerance for any Jewish state in the region whatsoever,
sure,
without there
absolutely.
being any idea that, oh, the IDF is some oppressive white colonial mechanism. Like there was no IDF, and they were still trying to get rid of us.
Exactly, exactly. Remember, Israel calls for peace with all of its surrounding neighbors and for the Arabs living within the land of Israel to be, just live peacefully amongst us. And there was originally a partition plan that the UN voted on November 29th, 1947. Again, we don't want to go back to this in too much detail, but it's an obvious no-brainer that had the Arab world accepted a Jewish state, which was sanctioned by the same international bodies that created the rest of the Middle East, as opposed to making Israel the exception that cannot be allowed to exist despite everyone else's existence, then none of this would have happened in the first place. So Lebanon was just a small player in a big picture of the extermination of a Jewish state. It's going to be stillborn. 1948, we're going to drive them into the sea. But then
And
that all, what's
at that point,
yeah,
there was no Hezbollah. It was the
no,
Lebanese government that was behind this. So just
exactly,
because as we
exactly.
get to Hezbollah, that's important to understand. So, okay, got
But
it.
as a byproduct of the War of Independence, we have the creation of, we talked about the ethnic cleansing of probably 800, 850,000 Jews who were living in various Arab states in North Africa and the Middle East, including Lebanon, by the way. There was something like 9,000 Jews living in Beirut. I have one of my really close friends who's a Syrian Jew, because that's considered Greater Syria. He's part of the Syrian community in Brooklyn, was born in Beirut, and he speaks this really well. He speaks French, English, Arabic, and Hebrew. But
Wow.
that's born in Beirut because it was French influence. So French was kind of like the language, like it was in Morocco, even though it's not the indigenous language. So these Jews were ethnically cleansed between 48 and 67. Israel rescued most of them, and a huge percentage came to Israel, and a lot of them went other places like to France and Montreal, whatever. Um, but that created, again, we don't want to go into this whole discussion of the creation of the Palestinian refugee issue. And even at the time, they were not calling themselves Palestinians, they were Arab refugees. But a lot of them fled the fighting. A lot of them were told to get out of the way. Some of them, it's a whole discussion. But like 100,000 Arab refugees, today called Palestinians, fled to Lebanon. And Lebanon, by the way, as all the surrounding Arab states, refused to absorb these immigrants, unlike Israel that did. That population has now grown to many hundreds of thousands, still living in the refugee camps, which no longer look like refugee camps with tents. They're like suburbs. They have buildings in them. That's what happens when you're permanent refugees for 3 or 4 generations. And by the way, they were subject to, as they were in other Arab states, like you get in Jordan, they could not get citizenship or passports. They were not allowed to own land, severe restrictions on owning businesses, travels restricted, locked out of positions like being doctors and lawyers, and left to fester on,
So
often in the southern areas, in the areas that border Israel, but in the sovereign territory of Lebanon. And this scenario will be repeated in many places. And again, just like had the Arabs accepted the partition plan, allowed a Jewish state to come into existence, there would have been an Arab state born within the boundaries of Israel in 1948, but they rejected and tried to destroy Israel. So too had the Arabs done to the refugees from Israel, from the fighting, done what the Jews did to all the Arab, Jews of Arab lands who were thrown out of those or evacuated from those territories because they were suffering persecution. There'd be no Palestinian refugee issue today. They would have been absorbed in a massive population exchange, which has happened to literally tens of
right. So
millions of
meaning
people since
Israel
World War
absorbed
II.
850,000 Jews from Arab countries over that period of time and gave them citizenship, allowed them to work, basically created an immigrant-based state. But even though there were Jews present in the land from the entire, that whole time. But when Palestinians went to Lebanon as part of that switchover, not only were they not granted citizenship or welcomed there, they were basically treated as second or third class citizens, not able to work, kept in refugee camps. They were treated really badly. So the Lebanese uh, um, basically are keeping their Palestinians in a kind of um, holding cell in a certain way.
Yeah,
It's really strange to think about, um, that there are other states in the Middle East that are literally keeping Palestinians oppressed in their own countries.
exactly. And it also creates even a more complicated mix within Lebanon, which is Maronite and Greek Orthodox and Shiite and Sunni and Ismailia and Alawite and Druze. And so now you got to throw into that the Palestinian population, which might be Sunni in their religion, but is not the same thing as the more the older original Sunni Arab population that's living in their own villages. These are groups are not mixing with each other at all. And that, by the way, to fast forward through that narrative, we have the 1967 second attempt after 48 of this time, only three Arab states, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt trying to destroy Israel, which failed abysmally, which created further fleeing of population. In this case, you don't have refugees fleeing, a lot of the Arab population living in Jordanian occupied Judea and Samaria, also known as the West Bank, will flee primarily to Jordan, okay, or stay in and be what's called now they call the occupied territories, which are not occupied, they're disputed, whatever. But this is not an influx of additional refugees into Lebanon there, but this means that you now have you have the creation of the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1964, Ahmed Suqeri, created by the KGB, the Soviet secret police, through the Romanian secret police. It's a whole fascinating story. But you'll have a significant Palestinian population, including like Yasser Arafat, who's the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is an organization dedicated to the destruction of Israel. It's in their charter. It's not about a two-state solution. They end up in Lebanon. And what you have during this period of time is all kinds of like terrorist raids into Israel. You have it from the north in Lebanon. You have it from Jordan coming in. You have all over the place. It's a problem all over the place. But in 1970, it's called Black September. Basically, the Palestine Liberation Organization makes a coup attempt on Jordan because most of the population of Jordan are really the same Arabs. And the only reason why Jordan exists is that the army, which is an excellent British-run, British-equipped, British-trained army, the Arab Legion is Bedouin, different group of people ethnically, and Muslim, yes, Arabic speaking, yes, and very loyal to the royal family of Jordan. So in Black September, it's September 1970, several thousand Palestinians now are killed, and they are expelled, and they go
By Jordan. They were
by
killed by the
Jordan
Jordanian
because
army.
yeah, because they who did not like them at all in the first place. I mean, there's open discrimination against these people. Then they didn't want them. Now they try and rise up and revolt. Forget it. We're going to try and take over the country. No way. So they flee. They then pour into South Lebanon, and they are going to destabilize Lebanon, which triggers a civil war. When you have a very delicate balance, and Lebanon is such a delicate balance, the different groups of people all trying to not kill each other, but throwing that match into the tinder, it ignites what's called the Lebanese Civil War, which is going to go all the way from basically 1975 to 1990, really.
Wow.
And
Wow.
and 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 the Palestine Liberation Organization will take over South Lebanon. They will turn into a terrorist launching site. They'll start shooting Katyusha rockets into the Galilee and Israel.
Mm-hmm.
There'll be cross-border attacks there. In 1978, a bunch of guys basically come by the water into Israel. It's the coastal road attack. And that's going to lead to, I don't remember how many, it's like 36, I think it's like 37 Israelis killed and something like 78 wounded, like a massive terrorist attack until the terrorists were finally eliminated, coming, because by sea, invading, coming, landing on the beach and attacking Jews. And Israel will invade in 1978 South Lebanon and go up to Litani River, which maybe some of our listeners will recognize that that term has been floating around. Litani River is a river that flows east-west in Lebanon. It kind of mirrors the border with Israel-Lebanese border just north of it, about
Mhm.
20 miles, 19, 20 miles in. And it's kind of a natural border that you want to push belligerent forces back, because what we've seen emerging in Lebanon really since the 70s, since the PLO, is the failure of Lebanon as a state to control its own border, which begins with the Palestinian Liberation Organization embedding itself in the 1970s, and only is going to get much, much worse as we go
Okay, so
into.
I just want to reiterate this just in for my own head. So what happens is on Black September, there's an uprising where thousands of Palestinians try to take over the Jordanian government. They are defeated by the Jordanian army and they flee and embed themselves in the south of
Yeah.
Lebanon. And they basically embed themselves in the south of Lebanon, which triggers an imbalance in the population, which is so delicate in Lebanon, which triggers a civil war, which then lasts from 1970 to 75 to 1990. But by that time, the PLO is firmly embedded in the south of Lebanon, and it becomes kind of a base of sorts. Is that what happens?
I mean, they just embed themselves. First of all, they're fighting with everyone. They're fighting with the Shiites who hate them. They're really fighting with the Alawites and doing horrible things to them, like killing them, raiding. There's all kinds of internecine fighting, which destabilizes the country. And again, the government of Lebanon is not able to maintain control of its border, which is the one of the first responsibility of any country's government is the safety and security of its citizens. When a country cannot secure its own borders, this is a very serious problem. So this is
And
exactly what's going on.
and so is the PLO then Sunni? And does that mean they align with Saudi Arabia?
No, I mean, the Palestine Liberation Organization has been getting has gotten aid from other Arab states and moral support, primarily using them as a whip to flog Israel, to make Israel look bad, to reorient the conflict from Israel being the David and the 22 states of the Arab League being the Goliath, to now Israel being the Goliath and the little teeny Palestinian areas, they're the smaller population, a smaller geographic area, they're now the David. So that's a whole
Mm.
nother discussion. But they're operating basically on their own. Throughout the history of the Palestine Liberation Organization, they've had allies like Saddam Hussein, who's a very big supporter of the Palestine Liberation Organization, shooting Scud missiles into Israel in the Iraq War in the early 1990s, to show his
Right.
support for the Palestinians. But this is basically this. So we had to. Israel goes and it's a military campaign, Litani, which they go in to try and clean out the PLO, and they end up pulling back. And that's a whole. I don't want to go into too many details on Litani. People welcome to Google the Litani campaign, which is in 1978 as a response to this terrorist attack, this coastal road attack. But then, if we fast forward to 1982, and this is when I arrived in Israel. In 1982, because of shooting missiles to Israel and a few other factors, Israel actually launches a full-scale military invasion of South Lebanon, because they see that border is not stable. The Lebanese army is not controlling its own border, and Israel goes. And by the way, Syria, which had already moved in the mid 1970s, Syria basically invades and takes over a lot of Lebanon, ostensibly to try and deal with the Lebanese civil war, but until they're finally gotten out of there, it takes a long time for them to actually finally leave. But Israel ends up engaging in the Syrian army in Lebanon, and pushing the Palestine Liberation Organization out of South Lebanon. That's I guess get them out of there because they're launching missiles. And they end up getting all the way to Beirut, surrounding Beirut, and trapping the PLO in Beirut, which ends up having very bad optics. This is Menachem Begin as prime minister. And in the end, what happens, not to go through the whole history of that, in the end, they do a deal where the Palestine Liberation Organization is allowed to actually leave. And they end up in Tripoli, they end up in North Africa. They're allowed
Wow.
to evacuate. This very famous image of them shooting victoriously. Israel had them trapped in there, but it would have meant storming into Beirut and causing massive, you see what happened in Gaza since October 7th. It would have been a
Right,
really nasty situation of urban warfare with the civilian population trapped
right.
inside, and that would have led massive destruction of Beirut. So
Yeah,
it's a whole international agreement where these guys are allowed to leave with their weapons, and Beirut is a port, so they can just like leave by the water and just travel around the Mediterranean, go to North Africa, and settle in there, which is where they remain until Israel invites them back in with the Oslo Accords in the 1990s. So you have like a 10-year
unbelievable.
hiatus there.
Yeah, that's wild. It is strangely familiar, though, in terms of I know one of the things that they were thinking about as trying to solidify some type of agreement with Hamas in this war was that the leaders of Hamas would be evacuated, that they would be allowed to leave and remain alive, and that would be the way that they would get the hostages back. So it seems there's a precedent for that, where they allow the terrorists to live and to leave only to allow them to fight again another day, which of course that we know the PLO eventually does.
But not only fighting us, let's invite them back into our country
Yeah,
and give them guns, which is the Oslo Accords, which is another whole topic we just don't want to touch now. But
right.
this is where you really have to focus in, because when Israel goes into South Lebanon in 1982, in the summer of 1982, in June, you should know that the Shiites are throwing like perfumed rice at the Israeli tanks, because it's like, my enemy's enemy is my friend. We hate these. We can't stand. No one likes the Palestinians, by the way, anywhere. It's like
So meaning
no
the
one wants them.
Shiites in Lebanon
Yeah,
are
yeah.
supporting the Israeli army to
They're
come
like
and get rid
ululated. Yeah,
of the PLO.
yeah, yeah. They're like throwing
Wild.
rice at the. I've seen some. I remember seeing some footage of it. The problem is, had Israel gone in, taken the PLO out, restored, and stability had been restored, and let's say the South Lebanese army, the Lebanese government had moved their army down and restored the delicate equilibrium. But no, Israel ends up getting stuck, creating a buffer zone in South Lebanon until the year 2000. So from 1980 to 18 years, that is primarily run by the South Lebanese army, which is Maronite Christian army with the backing of Israel. And now what you have an earlier organization that's called Amal. And Amal was a Shiite resistance organization that's founded earlier. But in 1982, you have the founding of Hezbollah. And Hezbollah is, which means the party of God, was, once they see Israel is not getting out of there, because it just doesn't work in the Islamic worldview to have be occupied by dhimmi, Jewish foreign dhimmi, or the status that non-Muslim monotheists have, that is supposed to live under the control and authority of Islamic powers. This is not going to work. So when Israel
Got
ends
it.
up
So
there,
so
so
Hezbollah gets formed because this party of God sees it as an offense to the Islamic religion that there are Jews in Lebanon and Israel for that matter.
yeah,
Is that
yeah,
correct?
exactly. And it's a resistance. It's a Shiite resistance movement, which also gets involved, like Hamas was, by the way, initially in social welfare infrastructure in Gaza, distribution of food and education and stuff, because you got to keep the people happy. It's doing some of that stuff, but
Mhm.
it grows into a massive entity, huge entity in Lebanon. But what happens is interesting, is when you get to the year 2000, when Ehud Barak is now prime minister of Israel, and that South Lebanese buffer zone is turned into it's kind of like Israel's Vietnam. Not exactly, because Vietnam is thousands of miles away, and Cambodians and North Vietnamese are not threatening, American citizens of the United States. But insofar as it's Israel's only occupation across its internationally recognized border, which was only done not for colonial, imperialist reasons, but merely to create a buffer zone between a state that was not able to control and, guard its own border. But it wasn't good. It was politically within Israel. It was very uncomfortable, and soldiers were killed. There was a terrible helicopter accident. A lot of soldiers were killed when two Sikorsky helicopters collided. Including my neighbor's son in Givat Zev was killed in that. Um, so Ehud Barak pulls out. By the way, the South Lebanese army collapses immediately. What should have happened is the Lebanese government should have moved its army down and taken control of the territory, the vacuum that's created by Israel. But what happens is Hezbollah takes control of that, and But the UN, in a rare show of objectivity, openly announces that Israel has completely withdrawn from Lebanese territory, and therefore there's no more complaints against Israel of foreign occupation, which should have meant that if the creation of Hezbollah was for a resistance movement to Israeli occupation of sovereign Lebanese territory, their raison d'etre, their reason for
Right.
being,
So
now
now they
ended.
don't need they did it. Like, okay, Israel's out. So why is there still Hezbollah? And is Hezbollah in any way connected with the Lebanese government? Like, so what are they doing now?
So this is where it really gets interesting. So first of all, they say power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is not a democratically elected system. Hezbollah is, the guy who runs Hezbollah, the Secretary General, is Hassan Nasrallah. You always see him. He's always living in hiding underground because he's the one that Israel would really like to kill. We took out Fouad Shukr like not long ago. He was one of the senior military commander of Hezbollah. But these people don't want to. They want to stay in power. And one thing I'll tell you, a rule about history and a rule about governments and a rule about power is that all totalitarian political entities, be they governments or movements, can only stay in power in a position of perceived conflict with an external enemy. And meaning when Gorbachev ended in 1989 the Cold War, the Soviet Union had no reason to exist. If you read 1984 by George Orwell, they always, the Ministry of Truth, which is of course a euphemism for the Ministry of Lies and Propaganda, is
Right.
always just rewriting history because we're always at a threat. Eurasia is at a war with your Africa. You have to always be in a state of conflict. This is how it works with totalitarians, and so
Hmm.
so Hezbollah kind of likes where it is. They're a major player. They control, like, poppies, the heroin market. They do a lot of black market here. Now their source of income is very interesting,
Right.
and because they're Shiites, they become very closely aligned with Iran, which is the darkest force in the Middle East. And Iran, we know, which has no history of conflict with Israel. The last time Persians and Jews fought was a really long time ago,
Right.
actually.
Right.
Persians and
So
Jews really
meaning
never
meaning
fought.
Iran at that time, the Persian people are not at war with Israel. It's only really when the
Yeah,
Ayatollah comes in and takes over Iran that it becomes a totally different, horrific regime. But okay, so Hezbollah is Shiite. The PLO has exited. Hezbollah stays in because they get very comfortable and they have a certain amount of power. So, what is the Hezbollah relationship with the Lebanese government? Are they part of the
ah,
government?
right. So what's happened since the year 2000 is, number one, Hezbollah, to maintain some sort of legitimacy, will make these ridiculous claims on Israel that these 5 square inches of this place, and primarily in the, like the Shabak farms, or there's even a big dispute over maritime borders, which has a lot of implications for gas drilling in the Mediterranean. They'll always maintain these like little, like, no, we don't like this. It's kind of like Hitler in 1938 with the Sudetenland. I need this little piece of territory because it's ethnically German. You got to maintain some sort of a facade of questioning, but it's insignificant stuff. Insignificant stuff. But what's happened is Hezbollah has emerged, first of all, as a major proxy of Iran. And Iran's beef with Israel has nothing to do with borders or history. It has to do with a bigger Shiite Islamic worldview of hegemony, not only over the entire Middle East. I'm not talking about Islamic hegemony. I'm talking about Shiite Islamic hegemony over the Middle East, and the illegitimacy on a theological, philosophical level of a dhimmi Jewish state being in the center of that Middle East. So we've seen that the shift has been, they've moved away from a resistance movement, which is no longer necessary, to an arm of a arch enemy of Israel, which is Iran, that in its very worldview is committed to the destruction of the Jewish state and using various proxies that it has created in the last few decades to basically surround Israel. We see with Gaza, with with Hamas, which is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is not Shiite. We see with the Houthis in Yemen, which is that southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. We see with these different militias that are in Iraq and Syria, and we see what's going on with Hezbollah in Lebanon. So Iran, which is in the back there, is the master puppeteer manipulating all of these different offshoot proxy forces. The goal is to surround Israel and destroy, whittle away at it, and take Israel out without having to directly confront Israel. And the largest of these entities has become Hezbollah, the Shiite resistance organization, which they claim has like 100,000 men and like 150,000 rockets, because they don't really have a lot of
Right,
anything else.
which I think you said means they are the largest non-national military
Yeah,
in the world,
right. The
is
largest
Hezbollah.
military force that's not a government military force, like 100,000. They are bigger than the joke of what is today the Lebanese army. They're a
So
larger
that was
military.
my next question. Like, so first of all, does that mean that if push came to shove, Hezbollah would basically win? And second of all, why does the Lebanese government allow them to base themselves in their territory? Are they a benefit to Lebanon in some way? I would assume there would only be benefit, or because they're scared of them. So which is it, both?
Excellent, excellent. This is where we have to understand. Hezbollah, as part of this resistance movement, and even when Israel was still in the South Lebanese army, Hezbollah made a conscious decision to now not just be this kind of militia on the border attacking Israel to get them out of there. They decided we're going to now be a player in Lebanese politics, adding a further layer to the Shiites and the Sunni and the Maronites and the Greek
Right.
Orthodox Druze. Now they joined in 1992. Hezbollah is in the Lebanese parliament has like 100 and I think 28 seats, and I think they got
Mhm.
like a dozen seats. And they actually have since then. I think in 2022, there's been no elections. Lebanon is a completely failed state today, but in I think at one point they actually controlled the majority. They and their allies controlled the majority of the Lebanese parliament, so they're actually in the government. And this government
And
is
why
very
don't they just go to take over all of Lebanon? Like, why have they not pressed for that?
well. First
It
of all,
would
that
seem
would
the
mean they
obvious
would
next
have to.
step.
Well, this is the best way of doing it, because they're not in a position to take over Lebanon. That would mean they'd be fighting internal civil wars. Trust me, there's a lot of Maronite Christians and a lot of Sunnis who would probably love to go after Hezbollah.
Got
And
it.
trust me, if Israel were to invade, this is me speculating, if Israel would actually invade South Lebanon again to go after Hezbollah, you would see different groups like the Maronites and the Druze, who are really upset at them now because of that missile attack that killed in Majd el-Shams in the Golan Heights, those
Yeah.
12 Druze kids.
Yeah.
You would see a lot of people doing payback on Hezbollah, because it's like they've kind of overstayed their welcome, and they've morphed into a cancerous sore on the southern part of that is now leading to look what we get to today. A massive amount of the destabilization within the country and a massive amount of destruction of Lebanon is taking place since October 7th, because Israel is striking Hezbollah, which, like Hamas, has embedded itself within the civilian population of South Lebanon. So they're stuck. They're doing this dance, and we know that Lebanon, basically, with the end of the Syrian civil war, which technically ends 1980, 1989, 1990, and finally, much later, we finally get, Syria doesn't completely leave Lebanon until like 2005, I think. Um, but ironically, fast forward, by the way, till 2012 in the Syrian civil war, to make even things more complicated. Syrian civil war, Syria should have ceased to exist as a country. If not for the intervention of Iran and Russia
Right. Right.
primarily, it would have ceased to exist because it was falling apart. But now they're gaining ground because they have the backing of Iran and Russia primarily.
Right.
A
I mean, in
million,
Syria, they murdered millions of their own citizens and just
right, right.
did horrific
But
things to
since
them.
but
So,
since 2012, about a million Syrian refugees have poured into Lebanon.
right.
Now, this is a country that has been
Ah, interesting.
under massive struggle and strife since 1975, gone through a very destructive 15-year-long internal civil war, Syrian occupation. We skipped another huge thing, by the way, in 2000. We got to mention there's so many pieces of this. In 2006, even though Israel left in 2000, the Hezbollah attacks two Hummers with reservists patrolling the border, hits one with missiles, kills all the soldiers in that Humvee, takes the dead bodies of other soldiers and takes them across the border, unleashes a massive artillery barrage on northern Israel, which is all acts of war. Israel goes in a very bloody war, which is the Second Lebanon War, which lasts for a month from July to August of 2006. That is finally, a ceasefire is finally brokered by the Security Council. It's Resolution 1701. Part of that resolution was, and this is the part that this is the worst mess, is because that was part of the resolution, as part of the Taif Agreement, by the way, in 1989, just to go back a little earlier, which basically ends the Lebanese civil war. All these little militias are supposed to lay down their weapons. Now,
In Lebanon.
Syria allows Hezbollah to remain armed to continue the resistance against Israel. This is 1989. Remember, Israel doesn't leave till the year 2000.
Right.
But as part of, fast forward to 2006 and UN Resolution 1701, which was supposed to be that there'd be no longer any militias and Hezbollah would no longer be on the border with Israel, because that's what triggered all of this in the first place. Them being on the border and with unprovoked attacking Israel, like we see in October, right after October 7th, unprovoked.
Right. Right.
Attacking Israel, because it's no longer about getting rid of the occupation. It's part of the proxy war. Let's kill some Israelis and kill some Jews. So the UN puts in peacekeeping forces, which we know that the UN stands for useless nothings, and this was useless nothing peacekeeping forces. They're of minimal strength. They can't do anything. They're scared of Hezbollah, and Hezbollah has not only remained embedded since 2006 on the border, but they've grown in size. They built massive tunnel infrastructure, far greater than Gaza. You can see movies released. These are tunnels like the Holland Tunnel, where they're driving massive missile trucks. They have now over some massive fighting force, which is this huge non-official state-operated army, which is very battle-hardened, by the way, having fought for many years in the Syrian civil war.
Wow.
They have all these missiles that are far more sophisticated. They have the drones. They're completely funded by Iran. So this, had the UN Resolution 1701 been adhered to, and had the Lebanese government been able to move its army down to the border and maintain the border like the Jordanian or the Egyptian army does with its borders with Israel, this situation would not exist.
So are
now
you, so is that
yeah,
is that resolution still binding? And does that mean that
yes.
Hezbollah is basically illegally occupying the south of Lebanon and has been doing so for the last few decades?
Well, again, illegal. I mean, again, it's that they're in violation of a UN Security Council resolution, which is binding on all member states. But this has nothing to do with a cycle of violence, nothing to do with occupation. It has to do with now them morphing into a massive military force that is the major fighting proxy arm of the Shiite Iranian government, whose sole goal is the destruction of the state of Israel. And we know that, by the way, just the last few years of what's happened in Lebanon, we had in 2020, you had the massive explosion of ammonium nitrate in the port.
Yes.
Which God knows what it was doing there. Because that could be, it's for fertilizer, but it's also for explosives.
Right.
Which killed hundreds. It was like, I remember watching, it was like a mini nuclear explosion.
Yeah.
The shock
Yeah. You
wave
can see
was
the
like,
footage of it on YouTube. It is just mind-blowing, the scale of that explosion and the destruction that it wrought throughout the city. I mean, you just buildings like turned into dust.
But I mean, they've never been able to get their act back together again. Rafiq Hariri, the prime minister, was assassinated in 2005, probably with the Syrian drug behind that one. Who knows? But what you've seen in the last few years is the complete collapse of Lebanon as a functioning country. It's basically a failed state. Their currency is worthless. 80% of the population wants to leave. It has a non-functioning government. Hezbollah, which actually I think has finally lost its majority control of the government, but still a major player. The Lebanese army is in no position to challenge Hezbollah in the south. So it's like, it's kind of like that. You see the similar thing. There's a lot of similarities with what's going on the Mexican border, where the drug cartels are massively well armed. They don't have tanks and stuff, but they got a lot of equipment, a lot of weapons, and a lot of money from the drugs and the smuggling, billions of dollars.
Right.
And the Mexican government is really not capable of controlling its own border. It's not
so
the
it's
same
almost like there's a country within a country, and like there's Hezbollah is kind of its own state within the state of Lebanon, but Lebanon isn't strong enough militarily or financially or economically or even more morale wise to kick out the squatters that have basically established themselves as a power in their own state.
Yeah, yeah. And it's such a tragedy too. We go all the way back to 1982 when Israel invaded and got the PLO out. Bashir Gemayel, the who was the president, who was one was about they were negotiating peace with Israel. They're going to negotiate peace with Israel, which would have been unbelievable for Lebanon. Lebanon was such a great, it was really a fantastic country because of its
Right.
great ethnic mix, and it was such a beautiful place. And I know people in Lebanon in the 70s and stuff. It was gorgeous. They called it the Paris of the Middle East. He was
Hmm.
blown up. The Syrians
Wow.
probably involved in that one because they didn't
Yeah.
want a peace treaty. We see that the history of people making peace with Jews usually ends badly. You can see that with Anwar Sadat. You can see that earlier, by the way, with with the history of Transjordan early on, like Faisal and Abdullah. These are people who all wanted to peacefully coexist with Israel, recognizing that the existence of this dynamic little Jewish Zionist entity, which is such a powerhouse for innovation and stability and
Right.
Western capitalism and economic
Education and
development is
technology.
great.
Right.
You think of the counterfactual historical thinking of what would have been in Lebanon had peace come in 1982,
Right.
open border, free trade. It just would have been all these Israelis would be vacationing in Beirut. It would have been unbelievable. But
Right.
now we fast forward from 1982 to 2024. The country is non-functional.
Mm.
Hezbollah is in this situation. They have to be involved in this conflict. Hamas, which is a major player. We don't know who
Wait, wait,
gave
wait. Can we just back up? Why
yeah,
do they have to be involved in this conflict? If they themselves don't care for the Palestinians in their own country, the idea that they're doing this in solidarity with the Palestinians is nonsense. So why do they need to be involved in the conflict?
because they are fighting force basically of Iran.
Got it.
They are taking their orders from the mullahs in Iran. This is part of, you have to pull back and look at the broader conflict. It's not about Palestinian state. We know it's never been about that. They could have had a state in 48, 67, in 2000, in 2007. There's no arguing this. It's always been about the Arab world's inability to accept a Jewish state of any size. We now have plenty of Arab states that accept a Jewish state. And since the Abraham Accord, we have even more, but we still have the hardcore of resistance is Iran, which is dedicated not just to destruction of Israel, but the destruction of Western civilization. Israel is the frontline buffer in that conflict. And
Right.
Iran is basically, this is this. We don't know what originally October 7, what was the goal, how much was Iran giving orders to Hamas to do this? What was Hamas's original plan? Was it part of a bigger conflict? Was Hezbollah supposed to invade from the north as Hamas cut through from the south? These are all things that may or may not come out later, but we know that right after the unprovoked attack on October 7th, do this piece of like people say that this circle of violence, it's not they don't call it circle, they call it the what's the word they always
The
use?
cycle of violence.
Cycle of violence, excuse me, the
Right.
cycle of violence. There was no cycle of violence. It was totally peaceful, October 6th. And in Lebanon, it was as peaceful as it ever is there. They're always embedded in there and looking out at us, spying on us
Right.
and getting ready to fight. But there was nothing going on. They just started firing missiles. Now, by the way,
Right. So, and I think that's the silent war that nobody talks about, which is, that October 7th was the incursion from Gaza into Israel, and then October 8th, in the burning ashes still of that massacre, Hezbollah starts launching hundreds and hundreds of missiles into Israel, but nobody talks about that. Right.
yeah,
It's like,
yeah,
oh, and it's kind of assumed that they're doing it because they support Gaza. But it's not so much that they support Gaza, it's that they want to get in on the possibility of eliminating Israel because they don't care about the Palestinians or the Gazans. They wouldn't let them work or live in their country as free citizens, anyways. So it's a
right.
funny conflation of something that actually they don't really like each other, care about each other. They just more like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They all want to get rid of Israel. So it's a really interesting thing that nobody talks about. What the heck is going on with Lebanon? Like, what's their skin in the game? And it's
Right.
not helping Palestinians.
Not helping them at all. But for Western consumption, they maintain this, support of our brethren Palestinian cause. But that is not the issue at all. That is not what is going on. But we're now stuck in this situation where we have really a full-fledged war, that for their point of view, it's a success. We got 85,000 Israelis to vacate the northern part of the country. Some are sticking around and living mostly in bomb shelters in the Golan Heights, but Kiryat Shmona is empty, and Metula is empty, and Miskav Am, right on the border, is empty. This is the idea. We'll whittle away slowly. We'll weaken them. We'll reduce their strategic depth. It's already pretty small to begin with, a country the size of New Jersey, and then we will finish them off completely. But we have to stop looking at this as anything to do with the creation of a Palestinian state. This is part of this much larger conflict of a clash of civilizations between radical Islam, primarily Shiite Iran, and its proxies against the Western world, but focusing first and foremost on Israel as the frontline state, but then wanting to go out and take on the whole. This is their idea. Let's spread the revolution. And the stupid part of it is you have a lot of the Europeans and the left in America siding with our enemies that are really against themselves. It's like shooting your own police. As the looters are coming into town, you're attacking your own police force, which is basically what has been going on. But what's really interesting about all of this, Ellie, is that first of all, the damage it's doing to Lebanon is insane. It's taking a terminally ill country and causing massive damage. And if this gets out of control, by international law, Lebanon is responsible for its borders. Israel could fully, if it wanted to, because as Eric Hoffer said, Jews are the only people in the world to expect it to actually act like Christians. We don't take revenge, but Israel could bomb all of Lebanon. It would take about 15 minutes for Israel to end any electricity in Lebanon, the water, everything, which is what people do in all-out war. We don't do it. We're focused even though they're embedded in the civilian population of South Lebanon, they just showed all the maps of where all the missiles they try and launch are in houses and between houses. Israel's focusing, but Israel will, if it really explodes into an all-out war, Israel's going to make Lebanon pay for this because they are responsible. Even though they're not in a position to do anything about it, you are responsible for it. But the weirdest part of all of this is these guys jump into the fight on October 8th to support Hamas, hoping probably for maybe that it's going to be an all-out war and everyone will do a full-court press. But I don't know what Iran's thinking is they're really calling the shots, but that it's going to take some pressure because Israel have to move military forces up to the border, which it did do, but did not stop Israel in any way from continuing the war, which is now going on over 320 days, about to approach the longest war in Israel's history. The War of Independence was also over about a year. But it did not stop that, but it's actually working against Hamas and what's going on because now it's distracting from Gaza. Because like the massive attacks, Israel, that's in the news now. And Israel is now more free to operate. And a lot of stuff has happened that is not even making it into the news. So it's been a disaster. It's only pouring salt into the wound, the festering wound of what is Lebanon. It is distracting attention from what is Hamas. It's not in any way saving Hamas from a destruction, but it's possibly drawing Lebanon into massive destruction. And again,
I've heard the idea floated, which I think is an interesting idea. Not I would have to understand more about how this works, but there is the idea being floated that these proxy wars are being fought because if there's Jews, it's news and it keeps the eyes of the world on Israel, while Iran in the background quickly organizes itself to have nuclear weapons, which it's on the cusp of having. It kind of takes the focus off, like, okay, go look over there because we're just doing our thing over here. There is a certain idea that there's a much bigger thing at play here, which is a much more dangerous piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. But Iran probably overplayed its hand. And the other real big loser in this is whereas Israel being stuck in Gaza in a war for its own survival against a brutal terrorist mass murdering enemy has gotten tons of sympathy. Look what's going outside the Democratic National Convention last week from the West and its allies in the left. When Israel's fighting Hezbollah, it doesn't have the same level of sympathy. Israel's not hitting civilians. And because everyone sees the connection between Iran, look at how much of the U.S. Navy has now poured in. Look at how much, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is in Israel. It's working against. It's brought a massive amount of foreign military force and support, just like all these other countries shot down those missiles in April. We're seeing now the biggest concentration of foreign military might is coming in, not because of Gaza, because Here, people get it's actually backfired. People get that this is Iran, this is bad
Yeah.
news, and this could spiral into direct confrontation between Israel and Iran, which has already happened, but get out of control and lead to
A full
like a
blown.
real full-blown war in the Middle East, which no one
Yeah.
wants. So
Right.
they are the hussy sore that is part of the cancer that is Hezbollah, that is the Iranians regime in the Middle East, just causing a lot more problems. But people really need to be clear on what is going on here and pull back
Yeah.
and see that big picture, which is this is a clash of civilizations. Israel is the front line, and there is no justification. And just like with had they not attacked, in Hamas, there'd be nothing going on there now. It's the same thing there. Israel is fully justified in behaving with tremendous restraint, far better than any country in the world, when its very existence is being threatened. So that's the kind of perspective that people need to understand. And that's where the pressure needs to be put, not on Israel, but on the
Yeah.
enemies of Israel, not just because we're in the right, but because those enemies are also the enemies of Western civilization.
So important. I feel like this was such an important topic to be able to understand the cusp of what we're on right now and what's happening in the news. And really one of the things that people aren't talking about, which is almost more important at this point than what we're dealing with in Gaza, other than the fact that we still need to get our hostages out of there. Um, Thank you so much, Rabbi Conspiro. Thank you for the conversation as always. I would encourage any of our listeners, please share, like, comment, review. Please send us questions. If you're listening on Spotify, there's a place where you can comment on every episode. We would love to hear from you. If you want to see this conversation and watch our funky faces in person talking, you can check it out on YouTube. Rabbi Conspiro is the YouTube channel. And otherwise, check the liner notes. It gives you a way to get in touch with us. You can suggest topics. You can invite us actually to come speak in your town. We're happy to do a live podcast. We've been talking about this a lot. So you can check out on Ken's website how to get in touch. But we're always open to doing some kind of a live recording, which would be really fun because then we can take questions from the audience. I think that's it for today. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.